Live. Hello and welcome to the launch of the Imperishable Seed, how Hindu mathematics changed the world and why this history was erased. I have with me very distinguished guests, and I'm very honored to be in this panel as part of the guests. And of course, we have our wonderful author, Dr. Kamble, with us as well for the book launch. So, without much ado, we'll get started on the book launch itself. I believe, Bhaskar, you have a copy you can hold up for us?
Yes, this is the beautifully brought out book by Garuda. So I'm really happy the way it turned out, the Imperishable Seed, and it was so many years in the making, and it's really nice to hold it in my hands. And yeah,
Absolutely. One of the things, just hold the book up again. One of the things we really treasure, at Garuda in bringing these books out is that a book itself should be a joy to hold and to own. In this day of digital media and everything else, we want it to be a piece of art. If you put your hand across the cover, it's tactile, it's embossed, and just the whole spirit of the book should come out, and it's part of the joy of life, having curling up with a nice book, getting away from the gadgets and doing that. So that was one of our aims, and I'm glad it turned out well. So thank you, Dr. Kamble. And I'm going to go ahead and invite. There's a lot of story in the writing of this book. It came to us almost, what's that, Bhaskar? Maybe 3 years or at least 2 years ago. Um, it was
yes,
long time.
yeah, I think it was in 2018 or so, that it
Yeah.
2008,
So
19. Yeah,
this book was like a labor of love. Of course, Bhaskar had already done so much work on it, and then when I first get it, and of course with Garuda we get so many manuscripts, and just the I started reading it and I got more and more engrossed. There was so much that I didn't know, and I thought I knew a little bit, because of my interest in this whole area of decolonizing math and science education. And but there was so much that I didn't know, and especially it was wonderful for me to see how Bhaskar had brought out this aspect of um, how these inventions and discoveries in mathematics were not just happened to be in India, but how they were completely linked to Hindu thought and linked to the philosophical ideas. And that was one of the things that really drew me in. And then we ended up, arguing and trading ideas, and less arguing. I would just throw out ideas, and it was almost like sending out Bhaskar on a research assignment and come back like 3 weeks later and say, "Oh, we found this and we found this," and it's a treasure hunt. And we went deeper and deeper into these layers. So for me itself, it has been a real joy to be part of this, to be part of the book, and of course to have then Professor Kak read it and give his review and write his forward. Um, welcome Professor Kak and welcome Professor Ramamurthy. Both of them have been very influential and instrumental in getting this book out. So I'm going to first invite Professor Kak to speak about the book and his share his thoughts with us. Professor Kak, of course, is very well known. I'm so honored. Professor Kak is a Padma Shri. He's the Regents Professor of Computer Science Department at Oklahoma State University at Stillwater. But most importantly at all, he has been working over many decades to turn this narrative to really tell the story of our civilization. And this is what really Garuda was started and founded for, which is how do we tell our own stories in our own words. And Professor Kak has been a pioneer much before us in saying, okay, this we've so many of the narratives are distorted, and how do we present and bring the real wisdom of India and the truth about India to the world. So please welcome Professor Kak, and love to hear from him.
Thank you, Sankrant, and I'm very delighted to be a part of Bhaskar Kamble's book release, The Imperishable Seed. As Sankrant just said, we are living at a very critical moment of history. Um, and we can see that not only in the last 2 or 3 years of the COVID hysteria and the response to it in different countries, and also the war. So this is the time when India, of course, is in PPP terms the third largest economy, and even in nominal dollar terms, it's the fifth largest economy, and probably going to be very soon the fourth. Um, so this is the point in time when we need to take stock and get free of the colonial mentality which has governed India's look at itself, India's gaze, if you will, at itself over the last 70 years, and assert itself in as truthful terms as is possible. And I think Bhaskar Kamble's book uh, is a very element in that reassessment, in that process of speaking truth to power, if you will, because the power is still in the hands of those who've been acculturated into it over the past many years, and they don't know what the facts are. They hold on to what they believe is the truth, uh, only because most of them, I would imagine, there are some who are ideologues or activists and who don't care. For them, their ideological warfare is more important than anything else. But a large number of people are honest people, and if they only knew what the facts were or what the facts are, and that's where I think Bhaskar's book is going to be so important. One of the challenges right now that we face in this world of social media and the internet is that information can flow as easily as good information. Perhaps bad information flows much better because it's assisted by established power centers or institutions who have a vested interest in the old story continuing on. And but now here is this great piece of work, and I am glad to have had a look at it when it was being written or after it was written, because Bhaskar was kind enough to send me an advance copy of the manuscript. And I think the Imperishable Seed is going to be extremely significant in changing the narrative, in people seeing the facts of what they are, because these facts, and many of them, are a part of this scholarly literature. You know, if you go back right to the 19th century and the 20th century, and now there's a whole series of articles which have appeared in the most reputed journals in the West as well as in India. And so scholars are aware, but sadly, the world of scholarship associated with history of Indian sciences is rather small numerically. So that even though people have been aware as to what the broad facts are, but the other question, of course, is the subtitle of the book, which is the erasure of this narrative. And that is a very complicated story, and I'll be glad to add some points to it later on. And that's the story of people in the West saying that they control the narrative. I can tell you on a personal note, in the late 1990s, when I was working on history of Indian astronomy and a lot of other stuff, and I had these friends from some of the leading universities, and many of them are still my friends, and many of them are very good people. But one particularly obnoxious professor at a university on the East Coast sent me an email. He says, "We decide what is right. We decide how India is to be interpreted." And this is a war which is, of course, much larger than just the history of Indian mathematics or Indian science, because for a host of very complicated reasons related also to Europe's own understanding of its own past, and the fact that their past, maybe it goes back 500 BCE or 1000 BCE, is so much younger than India's past. So that Europe, since it was dominant in the 19th or 20th centuries, wants to have the last word on how India's past is to be interpreted. So there are whole set of elements, including racism, including rank stupidity, and all kind of stuff. And some of that stuff is coming out right now in the works of many people. But let me stop here and let's hear from Professor Ramamurthy and have this conversation rolling.
Thank you very much. This is an interesting opportunity to discuss a volume which is rarely seen in this country. We are always approaching things with reservation. Can we do it? That question mark is always there. And when I saw the first manuscript, Bhaskar was kind enough to send it to me before. I realized that yes, there are so many things which we had no clue, and he has gone through the literature and pulled out many of these things. And sometimes you also feel, how I wish I had known this earlier, right? Such books don't exist in large numbers. And in fact, I feel this is one of the first books in this series. I hope it will trigger something. You remember even Ramanujam was not known in this country as much as he should have been known. An average student in a school or a college in our country do not know why Ramanujam is considered one of the wizards, mathematics wizard. And many people think that Ramanujam was discovered by Hardy. We have always been saying Hardy was discovered by Ramanujam. And there are things in Ramanujam's notebook which are not understood even today. In other words, they are very current. And within the last 100 years, we are not talking about 1,000 years old history, where one might say, well, you fellows always keep talking about the past. What do you do now? Ramanujam is a standing example that this is not something which was there and it has disappeared. It is there even today. It is a confidence which is missing in our country. And I'm very happy that Bhaskar has brought out this volume. I can see the amount of labor behind this. I also know the amount of dedication which he had put to bring out this volume. So put together the two, it has come out with a volume which I think should be read by every student who is interested in mathematics, who is interested in our traditions, who is interested in the history. And yes, things are forgotten, things are left behind for various reasons, not necessarily all the time. Somebody is behind it and planning it that way. History is full of such things. Things come, things go, and it doesn't mean that reflects the quality of the work which is being done. In the case of mathematics, what Kamble has done is to bring out many of these things, and a perusal through this book, more importantly, perhaps a very serious study of this book, will give an opportunity to understand the depth of mathematics in the past in this country, and its relevance to some extent in today's context, and spur the enthusiasm of the youngsters to take up new challenges in mathematics and possibly in all other areas of science and technology. Even in other areas of science and technology, such a thing does exist. I'm not aware of another Imperishable Seed book in physics or chemistry. Chemistry, for example, has been tremendously successful in this country in the past. Like, for example, simple things like the steel making. The way in which it has been done in the past is unbelievable, but not known to many people, including the scientific community. So maybe Bhaskar should take up some other areas also in future. What he has done to mathematics, he should also do to other branches of science and technology. I will like to extend my hearty congratulations to Bhaskar, and I hope he continues to be as productive as he was in bringing out the other volumes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ramamurthy. Just for a brief introduction, since we missed that in the beginning, we're also honored Professor Ramamurthy is Padma Bhushan. He's a nuclear scientist and S&T administrator, and very, very much committed to science and technology education and bringing right education to the country. And so many interesting points being brought up by Professor Kak and Professor Ramamurthy. There is like in fact, Bhaskar even talks about this in the introduction to the book. This is like the skeptic's curve. We are our own biggest skeptics as we begin. I also was educated in technology, went, in fact, Bhaskar and I share the same institute. We both went to IIT Kanpur. And even when I'm talking to my friends there, or even how I was, it was very easy to dismiss it because we've been almost conditioned, brought up, and to use that much used term, really colonized in the mind, where when somebody says, like, guess what, algebra came from India, we're like, nah. It's like, oh, you're just making things up. This story doesn't make sense. Where is the evidence? Nobody has written about it. And when we say nobody, it means somebody in the West has not stamped this as knowledge. And even if they have, it's not become widestream or mainstream enough for it to be accepted. And I remember Professor C.K. Raju making this really interesting comment, who's also done wonderful work on mathematics. We've all been inspired with him, by him, and Bhaskar references his work many times. And he says, the narrative requires no proof. It is self-evident. The counter narrative requires volumes of proof. Because there's nothing needed to prove that Euclid wrote the elements or Pythagoras invented the theorem. It's like, duh, every child knows this. What's even there to prove about it, right? So we don't ask for evidence. We don't even say, okay, where is the evidence that this happened? But when we have to disprove it, we need to marshal mountain loads of evidence, say, well, this doesn't really add up, and here's the evidence, and here's the evidence. So the challenge of those who are challenging the narrative is in a way much greater than just repeating what has already been said, and much of that actually does not have real evidence behind it. So the other thing that really struck me was, even everybody says, okay, well, Indians invented zero. What's the big deal? It's just a big fat zero. So we kind of make it a null operator, we nullify it. But even for me, it took me a while to have that significance sink in. It's just not another number, but without that, there is no decimal system. And what our forefathers did, or our ancestors did, was really to create the entire decimal system, without which no modern mathematics or modern science is possible. And so the way, one question to ask somebody simply is, write down 32,566 in Roman numerals and then square it. Can you show how you're going to square this, right? And then you realize there's actually no way to do it, because what happened was not only that we invented zero, not only did we create the decimal system, we made mathematics algorithmic. So there could be an algorithm. In fact, this is the debate that Bhaskar brings up so nicely in the book, that they were the abacus and the algorithmics. So there were the people who were using algorithms to solve math, and there were the people who were using the abacus to solve math. And there was a contest in Europe for a long period of time, till the algorithmics were just so much superior that they won out. But it was a period of almost 200 years before Europe could even accept zero and accept or understand the concepts that Indian mathematics was developing. And so it's not zero, and it's not even just the decimal system. but really the whole system by which we compute in mathematics. So that's why all of arithmetic comes from there. And then if you look at the decimal system itself is a polynomial. It's a polynomial to the power of 10, right? That's how the number expands. So you really have to start understanding algebra to even construct the decimal system. And then of course the symbolic notation and all of this is well known. But when Bhaskar came up to me and said, well, we had algebraic equations, I was like, no, don't tell me that. Show me. How did they write an equation? So we went back into the sources and said, okay, this is exactly how they were writing an equation. It was written vertically. And the book has examples of how the equations were written. So we went back and made it much more real and tangible, and so that we can actually look at the algorithm, we can look at the Sanskrit verses, and we can wrestle with it, and we can really come up with all of these possibilities and the way that they had put it together. The story of so many of the mathematics was tied to, of course, the geometry for altars and Vedic rituals, but there was also poetics becoming so much central part of how the mathematics came about. And then of course there was the observations in terms of astronomy, and how those tied back the calendrical system, and how those tied back to the development of mathematics. So Professor Subhash had promised us another round where he would go deeper into some of it. So I'd like to invite you back, Professor Kak, if you'd like to shed lights on particular topics that struck you out of these.
No, absolutely. You list several, background activities which led to development of certain things, and of course, there's also Panini's Ashtadhyayi, which scholars believe is the very first computer programming like language, because it has rules. It has 4,000 algebraic rules. It also has meta rules about rules. If you want to look at the whole question of algorithms, why did it develop in India, and tie it up to certain larger epistemological bases of Indian culture and civilization. And these were that consciousness and mind are different, and mind is an instrument, and therefore instrument-like techniques should work in how the mind works. Which is not the case in the West. In the West, consciousness and mind are conflated. So there was much more of a lack of clarity. So this is one thing. But I also want to talk about something else. The reason why these things have been erased is because India has not had an efficient or effective ecosystem of knowledge creation and its sustenance and its regeneration for each new generation, because that's what knowledge needs to be done with. For example, look at P.C. Ray's great book on history of Indian chemistry. That was written 100 years ago. Why haven't books like that been written subsequently? Because India didn't have any publishing houses. Before independence, some universities did a great job, like University of Calcutta or University of Allahabad. Some very wonderful books, seminal books were produced. But after independence, all that ecosystem disappeared. And that was a very small one. And we had, let's say, Motilal Banarsi Das, but it was mainly republishing books which had been originally done in the West, or reprinting books like that of Max Muller or Keith and so on, which had been published 100 years prior. So this old stuff kept on getting presented to every new generation again and again, so that even the works that were done in the interim in the West and in India were erased. So I think the main element missing in the knowledge ecosystem in India was really a modern publishing house, which is concerned with scholarship. Well, there are trade books, and they are a very important element as well, but also scholarship. And this is a great book which sits astride both. And that's what India really hasn't had. Perhaps it has had books where you can write on politics and so on, but not on knowledge of the sciences and the arts and the rest of the stuff. So it's a wonderful thing that Garuda has stepped in, and more power to it. And I think it's a beautiful combination that Garuda and Bhaskar Kamble have gotten together. And you need two wings for a bird to fly, and one wing is the institution, and the other wing is the author. And now we have both of those here for this book. So let this bird fly far.
Thank you, Professor Kak. I, in fact, also remembered Professor Ramamurthy's works that we need. I love that remark. We need the imperishable seed in all these science subjects. So, Bhaskar, you've got a task cut out for you. And I love the fact that the imperishable seed itself becomes a meme around this. We need the imperishable seed for chemistry, and we need the imperishable seed for physics. So all of these subjects are wide open. So much work to do, and we do have one book that came out, which is a brief history of science in India, also by a JNU PhD scholar. Again, wonderful collection of going through many different fields: chemistry, physics, biology, mathematics, taking us through that. But before we talk much about that, I want to invite the author, Bhaskar Kamble, to come and share with us, starting from what actually led you to write this book. And a lot of engineers and my fellow students at IIT and other people haven't really gotten into the history of what they're studying, or we study science and we study physics and we study math, but we never really ask the question, where did this come from? So how did that journey begin for you, and how did you come up and bring us this wonderful offering? Please share.
Yeah, so I think for me it was quite important for me to know the truth of where things have come from. So I, of course, for like most of the people, I had this assumption in my mind that the West is the superior civilization. They are the torchbearers of knowledge, and mathematics comes from them. It comes from Greece. Knowledge comes from Greece, and everything. I was brought up with this notion from right from the school days. And it was slowly, I think, I've also mentioned this in my book, at some points I heard from someone say that the so-called Pythagoras theorem was known in India before him, from Baudhayana and everything. This was sometime in 2010 or so. I heard from someone, and then I was like, I just dismissed it totally. Like, what is this? This is just right wing Hindu right wing propaganda. This was what the kind of thoughts that came into my mind, because I thought it's just this crazy people who want to claim that that everything comes from India, from everything from the Hindu civilization and so on. So I dismissed it like that because I was brought up with this thing, with this mindset. And but it was like 2 years later that I happened to come across, when I was starting to read these things more seriously. I was reading this book by Dharampal on the collection of Indian. He had collected a series of articles on Indian science and technology. So he had given one article by John Playfair called "On the Astronomy of the Brahmins." And there he mentions, this Playfair describes this method for calculating eclipses which the Indians used, and where the so-called Pythagoras theorem was used. And he says that it is interesting to note that this theorem was used here centuries before Pythagoras. And that really shook me, because it showed me the amount to which I had been brainwashed, I had been colonized into thinking that everything is just bad, everything is just backward coming from India, it's just about the caste system and so on. So I started researching more and more about this, and then I realized that actually all this information is there in the historical journals, in the articles, but they're all research journals. They're all in a specific niche. They're not at all in the public consciousness. The public consciousness consists just of this notion that India is backward and it's full of it's nothing but the caste system. And this was for me kind of really. Disturbing. In fact, I would say it was disturbing for me because I felt cheated from my teachers, from my peers, and from the education system. I felt cheated, and I thought I could not I could not actually I could not accept it, obviously. So I, I tried to collect all this information. I went on a deep study of these things and collected this information, and then this is how basically I started off my journey on my research into the history of Indian Hindu mathematics. So and I am aware of like two triggers in my book's title. One is called how Hindu mathematics changed the world and why this history was erased. So there are two triggers in this book, which also shows the level of colonization in most people. That the word Hindu itself is a trigger for most people. I hear that oh, why do you use the word Hindu? Why do you use the word Hindu? Hindu, it's not a religion, etc., etc., etc. So this for me was also. I think I should also make it clear that why I use the word Hindu mathematics in my title is that to make it clear that it refers to the Hindu civilization, and the word Hindu has become almost a dirty word in recent years, and people are actually apologetic, and people feel ashamed to say that they are Hindu, or to have anything to do with Hindu society. So this I feel very strange. I think this is really not okay. And most of the scholars, they have been talking of Hindu mathematics, explicitly Hindu mathematics, like till the 1980s, till 1990s. Only in recent years it has been people somehow feel this term is being avoided. And secondly, it's the mathematics, as I have tried to explain in my book, that this mathematics that arose in this civilization is closely tied up to the philosophy to the Hindu philosophy of the Upanishads, of the yeah, or basically the philosophy of the Hindu tradition. So this I will, for example, like give a simple example, like algebra. It's also called bija ganita. It's also called avyakta ganita. So if you read the Bhagavad Gita, for example, you will see the avyakta and the vyakta. Avyakta means the unmanifest, whereas vyakta means the manifest. So algebra, for example, has such a deep connection to the roots of Hindu philosophy. And I also wanted to make it very clear in my book, that it was not just about laying out the facts one after the other of the mathematics, but it was also about emphasizing this connection with the philosophy, with the knowledge framework. So in the West, for example, knowledge is totally 100%, it's a materialistic framework. At least there are some exceptions, some people who talk about this, which is against the common narrative, but the main thing is that it's a materialistic framework. Whereas in the Hindu philosophy, it is the materialistic and the so-called spiritual are both needed. You cannot have one at the expense of the other. So it is so-called this idea of para and the apara prakriti, for example, which is mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita chapter 7, para and the apara prakriti. So this is how the framework also is. I have been at some pains to describe in my book the framework of mathematics in this framework. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bhaskar, for sharing little bits of it. Again, I urge everybody who's tuning in to go and get your own copy of the book. It's very important to support the author, to support Garuda, so we can keep bringing out books like this. Really putting our support, giving our blessings. And also, this is absolutely a wonderful treat to read this book. I've just so much enjoyed. I read and reread it because I was editing it myself. There's only very few books that come from Garuda that I get so involved with personally. But as I said, this book was such a treat to read, and there was so much to learn that I kept going back to it and rereading so many chapters of it. So I'm going to take a little bit of open it up for questions. So if anybody has questions, we can ask any of the panelists or ask the author. And then meanwhile, any observations from the panelists. This is just a free speaking time. Please share. Professor Ramurthy, if you'd like to say something, or um, uh, Subhashji, Bhaskar. Otherwise, I'm going to share my own favorite tidbits that kept coming up. One of my favorite ones was this one from how Boole and Babbage and Mary, I think Mary Boole writes about this. Professor Cox, correct me if I'm wrong, but where she talks about like the Hinduizing of Boole and Babbage, and how profoundly that influence. Boole is the person that Boolean algebra is named after, and that was the whole binary system that the computers are named after. And Babbage is considered the inventor of the computer. And they were Mary Boole writes that the Hinduizing of these two men had such a profound influence on the development of that science. Something we don't hear, we don't know of, but all these kind of threads of influences that keep coming up and showing up in all these fields. I mean, astronomy, there's so much information on what was being done in astronomy. And also another thread that keeps showing up is this thread of plagiarism, and how it was erased, both how the knowledge is taken and then the origins are erased one way or the other, either just unacknowledged. And the Europeans seem to be worse at it than the Arabs. The Arabs at least were pretty open. This is from Hind. What the mathematics that they're taking is from Hind. But some threads like Fibonacci is very clear. Fibonacci acknowledges clearly that this is mathematics from India. But other people, especially when it goes the Jesuit, the entire origin of many of those things that are raised, and it miraculously shows up in Europe. So this sine tables or whether we are talking about calculus, the rudiments of calculus, it's kind of just miraculously shows up in Europe. But then you start tracing back, and there's the Jesuit trip that happens to India. And before that, you're not finding this whole continuity of knowledge that leads up to the developments that happen after the trip to India. So even though the origin is erased, it's like the mark remains, in time. So you can trace it back, and it's like a forensic, criminologist job to see how did this plagiarism happen. So that's also been a very interesting part of, for me personally, of reading the book. We have a few questions coming up. The first question is, do you have any feedback from Western mathematics historians? What was their reaction? Bhaskar, do you want to take it? And Professor Kak, please go ahead.
Yeah, not just this question, but perhaps put it in a perspective. You narrated the story of Mary Boole, her famous 1898 essay, I think it was, where she says how Boole and De Morgan and Babbage, who are considered the parents of modern computer science, they really learned from George Everest. And George Everest was the Surveyor General of India. And he used to go back to London from time to time. And Mary Boole said that these guys learned Indian Navya Nyaya, which has all the mathematical logic, which was done 1,000 years earlier in Bengal and Bihar. And so all this stuff is in the literature. And I can tell you personally, Donald Knuth, the granddaddy of modern computer science, he wrote to me on several occasions, and he wanted to find out, what had happened in Indian sciences, and he has included that in the revisions of his books. So this stuff is generally available in various books by the greatest scholars in the West. The problem is when books are written for the general public, or histories are written for school children or for college people, for various reasons outside of scientific ones, and that's where hegemony and control come in. The Indian contributions have been erased. So Western scholars are totally in agreement with all of this. They know it. It's a part of the general scholarship river that you have. The problem is that we haven't had books for the general public in India, especially, and in the West also, because people have to simplify matters. And a Western readership the author would say, well, why do we have to tell them about Bodhayana or about Panini? It's too complicated. So leave these names out. They're already familiar with the Greek authors. So let's just confine ourselves to that. The problem is that Indians haven't done the lifting that is necessary. And partly because we haven't had a healthy ecosystem where there was publishing which accompanied the work that was being done, because there's a lot of work that goes on there. What you write for a scholarly journal is not quite the same what the effort that goes into writing a book and producing it in a fashion which is attractive. So this is just the background that, in my view, this is all a part of stuff that all scholars accept. There's no dispute.
Yeah, and I may want to add here one small thing to the question that we just saw. That's in I have also it's very risky for Western mathematicians to go against the dominant narrative. So yeah, if for example, if someone mentions that, okay, the Greek manuscripts, they came all the way from Arabia, from Persia. They were actually translations from Arabic and from Persia, which actually were landed there about 1,000 years after the supposed creation in Greece, in ancient Greece. Does that not ring any alarm bells to you? So, but no, it does not, because for the West, it's like a very a convenient way of maintaining the status quo, that everything comes from Greece. So so as far as this book is concerned, I did not really I tried to contact some Western professors of mathematics and historians, but unfortunately I really did not get any response from them, or any interest for following this up further. uh, for example, yeah, I think this is what I would just mention.
But Bhaskar, when it comes to Pythagoras theorem and Bodhayana, not
Yeah.
only do you have the Saint Andrews, history of Indian mathematics thing where the correct chronology is given, but look at Manjul Bhargava, who's a Fields medalist. He's written on it many, many times. That Bodhayana was several centuries prior to Pythagoras. So, and he's a leading mathematician in the world right now. So I think my own assessment. Now, of course, in when it comes to research, there's a lot of ground which is always contested, because depending upon which lens you are looking at through at certain events, you can say, hey, we're not quite sure. Maybe there was also a contribution from this side or from that side, which is perfectly fine. We are all in it searching for the truth, right? But then, with all the facts that there are, you can make some general sweeping or broad statements, which is what a book such as The Imperishable Seed is all about. What is the broad story? Now, when you're doing a broad story, you cannot always take into consideration every infinitesimal detail, and that could be interesting as well. And that is the domain of the research article. And certainly you, Bhaskar, I'm quite sure, want as much of research being done into any of the contested questions, because the objective is the truth. And the truth to the extent that we can approach it, because the past is gone, but there are certain traces, textual and others, and there is forensics required, as Sankrant was saying. And so what can be said about the past which makes the most sense? That is the question.
I think Yeah, one of the interesting things that that Bhaskar also raised, that I found useful, was that, you know, in the section on why history was erased, what we see is that often the so-called mainstream accounts are built on this stack of history, which the foundations themselves are very weak. For instance, one of the most influential books on the history of India was James Mill's, you know, History of India. And when you look at the way he marshals evidence and the way he chooses to take evidence or discard evidence, so he takes very flimsy quote facts on which he bases his arguments. For instance, one of the things, this is a quote from the book, where he says, what the Hindus are saying is nonsense because they're coming with a date so ancient as to be entirely inconsistent with the chronology of the Hebrew scriptures, right? So if you believe that the world was, you know, 4,000 years old or 6,000 years old, then of course the Hindu dates are absurd, and they are absurd to people who are believing in the gospel truth of the gospel, right? So the one side is the truth of the gospel, which cannot be challenged, which is gospel truth, and the other side is these absurd Hindus that are saying the earth is millions, maybe even a billion years old, right? So that's the kind of thing that, and then they say, of course we know that like the Greeks have superior intellect and the Hindus are barbarian, and that's the evidence that is used to dismiss one part of history and take the other thing as true. So it rests contemporary history, especially if you start digging back history of science and mathematics. The primary sources are very tenuous, and a lot of them actually make this big round trip through Arabs, right? So the story goes that, well, it's all Greek knowledge. And how do we know it's Greek knowledge? Well, the Arabs had translated all this Greek knowledge and kept and preserved it. And now we are translating it back, and now we are claiming that it's Greek knowledge. Well, that's not really a primary source. That's happening 1,000 years after when you're claiming it's happening. And on top of that, the the Arabs were they were not in the business of just preserving Greek knowledge. I mean, they were in the business of learning things. They added a lot of their own learning and everything else. And so the basis on which a lot of the assertions are made need to be challenged. And this is where I find that Bhaskar's book is so central and so interesting in the way all these things are put together. Because once you start peeling the layers of the onions, you see that it actually is not resting on anything. It's all empty space inside it. And as we start pulling the foundations of this, I think this structure of the contemporary narratives of history are bound to collapse. And open-minded Western scholars, and I have interacted with some of them, have very much so. They are open, and they're starting to say, well, this is what the evidence actually says. C.K. Raju had put this challenge out there for an award for anybody who can prove that Euclid actually existed and is real. But you can ask any school child going in India, forget the West, and they'll say, of course Euclid existed. He's written a whole book, and that's what we study in geometry, right? And this very notion of proof. And I'm probably going to leave this one topic, which I think is very interesting and central. There was a thread out on Twitter which says, well, the Indians might have figured out the theorem, but Pythagoras is really the one who put together the proof. So what would you say, Bhaskar, about this notion of proof in India? And did we just imagine things out of thin air? Kind of
Yeah,
the
so
Ramanujan story also adds to that, or did we actually have this notion of proof?
so obviously there was a notion of proof in Hindu mathematics. So there was this. It was called, I think, Yukti or Upapatti. It was called, and it was like, and Bhaskara mentions it, for example. Bhaskara too mentions it. The different reasons, like, the importance of a proof. And there is, it's just that the West, the Sanskrit texts, they were written in, they have different styles of writing. So if you look at, for example, Aryabhatiya, from Aryabhata, it's just a sequence of sutras. It's meant for the knowledgeable person. So in there you cannot expect to find proofs. So and the proofs are given in detailed commentaries by the disciples of these masters. So Aryabhatiya Bhashya, for example, it's given there. So this is one thing. And secondly, you just mentioned about, like Pythagoras. Somebody mentioned that Pythagoras has given the proof. Well, if you look at the works of Thomas Heath, who is supposed to be considered to be the foremost authority on Greek mathematics, he writes in his book, there is no evidence that Pythagoras discovered the theorem known after his name. So and so and like, at least so this is and then if you also look at um, yeah, I mean, this is what I would just basically say to this, that the notion that there is no proof in Indian mathematics is actually a false one. So I have an entire chapter dedicated to this in the book. So yeah, you can, the further details will be available there. Right now I'm not, I don't remember everything right now, but yeah, you just
Well, I think
Yeah.
the message we are getting from Bhaskar is read the book. It has all the details, and that's what I would urge all of our viewers to do, and tell your friends. Please definitely go, and it's very important. The book itself is available on the Garuda Books website, on also other major retailers, grpr.in/tis. It's just a treasure load of knowledge, and it's such an enjoyable read. I encourage everybody to get their own copy, and definitely find to gift your friends. I just saw that Professor Dinesh had also in. I know he had been going in and out, perhaps there was a bad connection. Professor Dinesh, are you there? Hello. I guess the connection is still bad, so we'll have to catch up with him another time. So thank you everybody for listening and attending. Please share. This presentation is shared on YouTube with everybody you know, and buy the book. Thank you so much, and namaste.